Welcome to the Courier Mail newsroom. This is the lunch break, and of course joining me to talk about the debate between the unions and our very own Premier Campbell Newman is none other than Queensland Teachers Union President Kevin Bates, and from the Together Union Alex Scott, and of course the Courier Mail's own Bob McDonald. Thank you for joining me, gentlemen. Appreciate it. Alex, I'll start with you. What is the Together Union?
Together Queensland is the union that was formed by the amalgamation of the Queensland Public Sector and the Australian Services Union. We represent about 40,000 health workers, public servants and a range of other both public and private sector administrative staff. Of
course, your union was all the talk yesterday. Core public servants aren't satisfied with the offer of the 2.2% annual pay rise and the freeze on promotions, of course, we might add. But with Queensland's debt to apparently hit the $92 billion mark in 4 years, shouldn't members simply be happy just to keep their jobs?
Well, at the end of the day, we reject the analysis of the Audit Commission. The Audit Commission is a political exercise, not an economic exercise. What we've seen is that they've come out and talked about the black hole that we've known about for the last 4 years. What we want to talk about is making sure that the Campbell-Newman-led government adheres to their election commitments, and that was to revitalise public sector services, about lowering the cost of living. But there was a range of comments made in relation to the fact that the Labor Party was criticised while it was in government for offering a wage rise that wasn't keeping in touch with inflation. What we're now seeing is the offer being put to public sector workers in the core agreement is not a wage rise that doesn't keep cut in touch with inflation, but an actual cut in the amount of money that our members would get over the life of the agreement. So to talk about a 2.2% wage rise is actually a piece of spin doctoring by the government. What they're actually suggesting is a cut to public sector wages in the same way that they're looking to cut teachers' new starter wages and also the medical officers' wages. This is on the basis of an Audit Commission that has found nothing new in relation to the finances. The government knew about this before the election. What they're now trying to do is talk around the Audit Commission as a way of bullying public sector workers into taking a lower than expected wage outcome.
Bob, I'll welcome you into this conversation. Do you think the audit is a bullying tactic?
I think inevitably these documents are used for political purposes. I think, and the way they cast the numbers has a very specific point of view. At the end of the day, I think the numbers are probably reasonably accurate. I don't know, I mean, we're not suggesting that they've made them up, but they've picked out the numbers they want to use to make the point. And one of the figures I noticed that they talk about was under the previous government, they kept the actual wage settlements were always higher than their budgeted number, I think, and they were claiming this is going on year by year. So obviously that means unions are strong, but doesn't that sort of muck up the planning of governments?
Well, I think in terms of the outcomes, they have been consistent with wages policy. I think the attempt by the government in relation to the Audit Commission was to try and redefine how the budget is framed.
Sure,
so the figures aren't new, and that's what our concern is, that they're the same deficits that were projected previously. The argument about wage increases is manifestly incorrect in relation to that they were staying within budget. But the thing that they don't talk about in terms of the wage increases and the total employment costs was that there was a fundamental change in the public sector in relation to fixing the health crisis and the introduction of the additional year in schools. And those are things that are not going to get repeated, but they're things that bringing the public sector in Queensland into line with what we expect in every other state in Australia.
But what about Campbell Newman's argument that we've now got 20,000 too many public servants, or whatever number he's using?
Well, that's a saying in relation to where he'd like his budget to be. But he went to the last election clearly saying that he knew what the budget deficit was, and that hasn't changed. He clearly made a number of promises that are going to cost the government money in terms of reducing the cost of living. But he also fundamentally said that there was going to be a revitalisation of frontline services. You can't cut 20,000 public sector workers out of the system without affecting services, because the vast majority, over 2/3 of the public sector workforce, are employed in schools and hospitals. And if we have the cuts that they're suggesting, that will be about taking us back to the bad old days of the Bundaberg hospital system. And that was failed to be recognised in the Audit Commission, is that we needed fundamental reform to the health system. And that's what's now being said isn't going to be repeated year on year.
So there's no fat in the public service?
There's fat in any organisation, and certainly we've already seen a lot of jobs go. We've already seen 5,000 jobs go under the previous Labor Party, and probably a couple of thousand at least temporary contracts like to be cut. But this is an issue which they're talking about is in relation to significant collective bargaining is about to occur. They don't want to stick by the promises they made in relation to wages, and they're trying to say that there's this black hole that they've suddenly found, which is the same black hole we've always known about.
So as far as you're concerned, they're breaking election promises?
Well, clearly they said in the lead up to the election that they are talking about wages matching inflation, and they criticised the previous Anna Blig's office in relation to that. What they're now saying is they want to actually cut wages rather than actually keeping, even not try and keep touch with inflation. So new starters in schools, in hospitals and in relation to the poor will actually be worse off than they would be if there was no agreement at all. So I think it's more a matter of the taking a very aggressive approach to trying to provoke a fight with their workforce rather than working collectively to find better ways to deal with the budget deficit.
And I think if I can jump in, I mean, one of the critical issues here is about this question about where's the fat.
Yes.
I'd have to say very clearly that in education there isn't any.
Right.
We've been a low-tax state in Queensland for decades. The income that's coming into our economy is not sufficient to meet basic service needs. So in education, what we're facing is a situation where we've had a low-income state that's been funding education at the lowest level in Australia, and a country that's been funding education at the lowest level in the OECD. So you start to stack those things up. When you go looking for cuts, the bones are bare. There is nothing left for people to start to claw back in the education system.
Right.
And when we start talking about the sorts of cuts of this 20,000 magnitude, you can't do that without impacting on those core services of education and health, as Alex has mentioned.
One of the Peter Costello recommendations was a sort of a, what do you call it, a root and branch review of public services and that sort of thing. Would you, as unionists, be willing to participate in that sort of process and sit down and just, go line by line and work out what we actually need by way of public service?
Well, we've been putting together a 9-point plan which includes the identification of waste, and the government hasn't. We've recently met with the Premier about it, but up till now there's been very little engagement around that. We think there needs to be fundamental reviews about some of the problems of the government structures.
Sure.
And we've said that needs to be addressed in a collaborative way rather than an adversarial way. At the moment, the government is listening to the same advisors that advise NBI in relation to how to do enterprise bargaining and how to sell our assets. So I think if you're looking at those sort of approaches, what we need is a system where we're trying to find solutions to the challenges rather than trying to generate fights which are good for the media but bad for the public sector.
Right.
What we also have to look at is the reality of the offers that are on the table, because it's very clear to us that in education the offer's not about cutting costs, because as I say there aren't any there. So instead it's about actually attacking teachers' working conditions, the learning conditions of students in our schools. That's what the government is putting on the table. If there's a genuine argument about there being some largesse in the education system that would allow the government to claw back money, then we would sit down and talk about that. But this is actually about attacking the working conditions of teachers and the learning conditions of students, and on that basis it's unacceptable.
Okay, so Kevin, what's the timing from here? You've got a rally this afternoon at 4 o'clock.
Yes,
or 4:30?
we've got this opportunity this afternoon for teachers to voice their concerns to the government. This is a great thing about living in a democracy, is we can stand outside of Parliament House and send a very clear message to the politicians about where we are on this. But we're in a very tight time frame here. Our agreement expires on the 30th of June. That's just next week. So, really teachers need to stand up and have their voices heard today, and there will be an ongoing campaign, a public, political and industrial campaign to get these messages across to government. And I might just add that one of the critical things, I think, is many of the things that the government want to take away from teachers are things that have been fought for under both Labor and coalition governments over the last 20 years. Nothing's ever been handed to teachers on a platter, and much the same for public servants. One of the most offensive things that we've heard in the recent days coming out of government was this issue about allegedly Labor governments just rolling over and giving unions everything they want. I think people need to cast their minds back to dispute after dispute after dispute with teachers in education, and it's in those dispute situations that we've been able to win the conditions that we currently have. And that might have meant that government has underestimated the real situation in terms of the value of teachers or of public servants, of nurses, of police. But that's an issue for government. There's been genuine negotiations, there've been engagement under the law in legal fashion, and we've got the outcomes that we've got. This government's got to play by the same rules.
Kevin, you mentioned the rally this afternoon. It's 4 p.m. outside State Parliament. We have the live stream of that right here, couriermail.com.au, so tune back in from 4 p.m. We'll be live streaming. We'll have our camera crew out there to capture all the action.